I was brought this horizontal bandsaw at work. They asked me to get it operational again and clean it up a bit. I noticed that there was a large amount of rust and damage to the machine overall. I was told that this was due to improper maintenance and a lack of using the right coolant mixture on the actual machine itself. From what I was told, they only used water for some reason on this cast iron machine. I started out the restoration fairly optimistic. I was hoping that with a little bit of Scotch Brite and time, I would be able to remove the rust from the wave. Also, this was a way of gauging exactly how much the rust had actually penetrated the open pored ways that are just cast iron with no protection. I hoped a little bit that really the damage wasn't as bad as it seemed, that the layer of rust was really quite thin, that I'd be able to Scotch Brite really quickly and get it all off. However, I very quickly realized that that was not the case, that the damage was far more extensive than I could have even imagined at the time, and it was going to be a lot of handwork and power tools and air tools to actually get it cleaned up. With restoration projects, I try to keep all Scotch Briting and sanding to hand sanding and Scotch Briting rather than using power tools. I find that it leaves a much more consistent finish and is just not as aggressive as the power tools and air tools. However, with so much material to remove, I ended up having to go to those tools. As we move to the side of the machine, we can start to see the actual damage to it and the extent of it. All of this particle on the side is not dust, it's rust that has accumulated into what is essentially a rock. And this is accumulated across the entire side of the machine. I was pretty surprised to see the extent of the damage. I had come across rust buildups like this before, but for the most part, it was on pieces that had been abandoned in barns and places with flowing water where the rust would be allowed to build up. I had never seen this on an active machine before. In some areas around the base, the rust had built up quite a bit. At its thickest, it was about half an inch from the actual metal itself. This was nearest to the front blade guide where the majority of the coolant was going. And with the amount of buildup, I have to assume that the majority of this rust buildup came from cutting steel and allowing it to rust with the water. I very quickly realized that the scraper was not going to get me very far, so I pulled out a brass brush and began to scrape away. This is a fairly firm brush that was quite aggressive on the rust, and even then, it was not taking it off all that quickly. It was nice to see that there was still some paint underneath that was protecting most of the base. This small ridge that I'm picking at and taking the pliers and seeing if it'll knock off easily is a very heavy buildup of the rust. I thought I could get under it with the scraper, but in the end, it just wasn't coming up very easily, and I ended up taking a hammer and punch to it and likely knocking it off. The hammer and punch are fairly effective at removing this rust rock. It needs just a light tap for the most part to dislodge from the paint. On the bandsaw table, there's a channel that allows the coolant to flow, and as you can see, the rust has filled that entire channel in and has now made it level with the ways. I ended up having to use the hammer and punch to break up and dislodge a lot of this rust, and then go through and actually finish it up with the brass brush. Due to the large amount of rust that I actually needed to take off of the machine, I moved from the hammer and punch to using a needle scaler to break up the rust and a brass brush to finish up after it. The needle scaler is much more rough and dislodged quite a bit of the paint in the process of removing the rust. However, my job was to get it more operational than pretty, and with the right coolant mixture, the lack of paint would not actually cause this machine a problem. I set about cleaning the ways with a die grinder with a Scotch-Brite pad on it. While this can be pretty rough on the material sometimes, I knew that I was going to end up going over with a boat stone later, so I wasn't really that concerned. I just needed to get the majority of the rust off. To smooth out the surface finish, I go over it by hand with some Scotch-Brite just to make it look visually a little bit nicer and to smooth it out in general. I end up using a lot of WD-40 and some Scotch-Brite to kind of work the WD-40 into the material. Cast iron is porous, so I want some oil to actually take into the metal itself so that it'll actually preserve it. I take the needle scaler and the brass brush to the pan that the coolant collects in. This isn't strictly necessary, but I did want to see if there were any large holes just because of the amount of rust, as I didn't want it to leak when we put in new coolant. as this machine gets used more and more, a lot of this will be washed away by the new coolant mixture, but I did want to make sure and check for those large holes beforehand. The lead screw that the adjustable vise attaches to and the back plate, as well as the actual screw itself, all needed heavy cleaning. So I went and took all of those to the wire brush to kind of just clean them up real quick. And they actually came out looking fairly good. There is some problems with my lead screw. Namely, I ended up having to file it to put a new key into it because it had been roughed up and the key was lost. However, overall, the parts don't look to be too damaged where I would have to fully replace them. The head of the saw was not as bad as the base, simply by virtue of it not coming into contact with coolant as much, the coolant being water. However, it was still fairly rough. The wheels had been frozen to their spindles, and I had a really difficult time taking them off to polish them up. The raceways were almost completely destroyed by rust, and they needed to be cleaned. This small coolant bucket that lays underneath the saw had to be cleaned up as there was a large amount of rust that was living in it, and the pump was badly damaged by the amount of rust too. Later, I was taking a boat stone to the ways. This will have to be redone as there's a high ridge in this way along the slot. However, I was trying to smooth out this section so that the vise will travel on it more equally. We don't want to have any high sections because then the force is displaced on those high sections rather than across the entire vise, which pushes undue stress on the actual machine itself and the table. This was quite a long process because the table was not flat to begin with. The rusting did not help at all. I noticed that along the slot there is a very large raised section. As I was grinding with the boat stone, the only places that were lightening up, which means that I'm actually cutting, was around the slot, which means that I think that during the manufacturing process, when they actually formed the slot in the bed, it pushed up a large amount of the material. Later on, I will have to go back and hand file a lot of this bed and do Prussian blue to actually get it level. However, we'll do a separate video on that. The vice pieces were much easier to stone as they didn't have as many rough edges or burrs that were kicked up. They were fairly flat to begin with, and with just a little bit of work, I ended up getting them much better. I ended up spending a lot more time than I was hoping to on this, as I was hoping that the ridge would give at some point, and I would actually be able to get the table level with just the boat stone. However, after several minutes of just grinding by hand, it became apparent that I was going to have to go through and do some more major filing on this bed. After tentatively buttoning things up, I filled the machine with coolant just so that I could get that to circulate a little bit, see how much debris it would actually break up, and just let it run for a little while the system kind of broke in. Unfortunately, the way the hose was angled caused quite a bit of mess on the floor, so I ended up switching the way that the hose was oriented so that it was not splashing around as much. Unfortunately, it was not getting the inside of the cover and helping that break loose, but I was still getting the majority of the pan that was cleaning out and actually circulating the coolant enough to break up some of the rust. After letting the machine run for a while, I started to put it back together as I was pretty much finished for what I could do now. With the table being scraped down, the vise moved much better. Some of the screws I didn't have time to wire brush or re-tap and thread at the time of filming. However, going back, I have, and now it's a much cleaner machine that works a much better. You don't have to force screws or bolts in where they should naturally fit. I then finished buttoning up the system and sprayed some WD-40 just to try and seal in some areas that might need it. And that's it. That was the full restoration, at least operationally, that this machine needed. There are some cosmetic things that I really wish I could have done, namely a new coat of paint. Also, the coolant line needs a new valve to help it along. But operationally wise, this is pretty much good to go now. Some things to consider is before actually using this machine for any real amount of time, the gear oil needs to be exchanged, the hydraulics need to be lubed, and the electrical needs to be sorted out to make sure that it's all safe, especially with the amount of coolant that is in the machine. I spent a long time working on this machine to get it back to where it should have been in the first place. Had the operators just used the right coolant and done basic maintenance on the machine, I wouldn't have to do it, and it would have saved them money in the long run. It's simple things that we can do for our tools that end up saving us the most amount of money. While this isn't the nicest saw in the world, it is a working saw, and as long as we maintain it, it'll continue to work. We won't have to buy another one. It is a good skill to be able to maintain your tools. It will save you a lot of money in the long run. Anyway, thanks for coming by Shop Class. We'll see you soon.